Welcome everybody. My name is Dr. Jane Webb Williams and I'm a university lecturer at the University of South Australia in Adelaide, Australia. I'm speaking today for the European Conference on Education 2013 and my presentation will be on children's self-perceptions in relation to others. And in particular, I'm really looking at social comparisons in the classroom and the effects these social comparisons have on children's self-beliefs and on children's self-efficacy beliefs. My presentation is going to explore children's self-perceptions, their beliefs of themselves as they relate to other people, and this is social comparison. And I'm particularly interested in to find out how children perceive information they get regarding others in the classroom and how they utilize this information to form their own self-assessments and how they form their own judgments of self-efficacy in the classroom environment. Now, there are three related concepts that are involved in my study: social comparison, self-efficacy, and academic performance and well-being. And today I'm going to focus my presentation mainly on social comparison and self-efficacy. And although I do touch on the implications for well-being and academic performance, I'm not going to talk at length about these aspects. So some background on self-efficacy. Well, self-efficacy is part of Bandura's 1986 social cognitive theory. And in this theory, Bandura defines self-efficacy as people's judgments of their capabilities to organise and execute courses of action required to attain designated types of performance. So what does that mean? Well, self-efficacy really is therefore not concerned about the capabilities that you actually have, but your perceptions or your beliefs about what you can do with these capabilities. And so, according to Bandura 97, these self-efficacy beliefs and self-perceptions of capability can determine how people think, how people feel, how they motivate themselves, and how they behave. And so therefore they really constitute the key factor of personal agency, which is the power that individuals choose to have over their own courses of action. And they're instrumental to the goals individuals pursue, and they control that individuals have over their environment. Now, self-efficacy has been studied in many domains, and I myself conducted a study a few years ago in 2006 in English primary school classrooms with children aged 10 to 12 years. Now, in the study I conducted on self-efficacy, I looked solely at self-efficacy and academic performance and was able to see a very strong positive correlation between self-efficacy and academic performance. The level of specificity was very key, with the self-efficacy for task performance much stronger correlated with academic performance than a more general self-efficacy measure. However, what this indicated to me was that in the classroom environment, the children's self-beliefs about their capabilities, if they had very strong self-beliefs, they tended to have high performance, and if they had very low self-beliefs, they tended to have low performance. Now, that was on the whole. When I looked at the data, there were individual differences that occurred, and some children did in fact were outliers to this, and in fact had very high sense of self-efficacy, but a corresponding low performance. And these children tended to be the children that wouldn't listen to the teacher, that would actually tend to want to race through their studies, race through to get things done, finish quickly, and not listen to anything that the teacher would say, but in fact would feel that they were very competent at something, but they in fact weren't. On the other end of the scale, we had outliers, individuals that would have a very low self-efficacy, but actually a performance that's higher than the mean. And I worked with teachers on this study to look at how we could work with those children to increase their sense of their self-beliefs and perceptions on self-efficacy, but also their academic performance. Because self-efficacy has been shown to be a very malleable aspect and a psychological concept, unlike more of a fixed trait self-esteem. And so therefore we've been able to work within the classroom to be able to achieve these goals. Now, one of the 4 forms of influence on self-efficacy is vicarious experiences. And this is the impact that other people have on one's self-efficacy beliefs. Social comparison and modelling by peers, teachers, television characters, etc., all fall in this category. And for Bandura, this form of influence was the greatest when individuals were uncertain about their own capabilities, or when they encountered new associates, such as when children change school or start a new school. And Bandura tends to maintain that self-efficacy beliefs are instilled by social comparison, can influence performance through their mediating processes. And this is really the aspect of self-efficacy and the influence on self-efficacy that I wanted to focus on for this study. So, social comparison, which is the perceptions of self in relation to others, was first forwarded in 1954 by Festinger. And essentially, his original theory states that all individuals have a spontaneous human drive to evaluate their own opinions and their own abilities by comparing them with the abilities and opinions of others. So, Festinger thought that social comparison processes were more likely to occur when it was not possible to base self-evaluations on objective non-social criteria, and that people prefer to compare themselves with people that they identify as being similar to themselves. So in this way, social comparison leads towards uniformity. And so what that means is that there's a difference of opinions or abilities tends to become accompanied by a change in oneself to be like the other person's, or a change in the others to be like oneself's. Now, more recently, Wood 1996 defined social comparison as the process of thinking about information about one or more people in relation to the self. Now, in this definition, Wood has now expanded the meaning of social comparison to incorporate comparisons with stereotypes and hypothetical characters. But one of the main things I want you to take away from the message of the slide is that social comparison in this way can be seen as an examination of the accuracy of one's own self-beliefs and attitudes, because in a way it encapsulates an important aspect of human social life, that other people provide the standards against which one can judge oneself. Today's social comparison research is often concerned with the situations in which people make upward and downward comparisons and the consequence of this on learning and personal well-being. So an upward comparison is a comparison that I would make with a person or group of people who I perceive to be functioning at a higher level than myself. So maybe I perceive them to be at a higher level of academic attainment, maybe I perceive them to be at a higher status, or maybe I perceive them to be performing better on a task, for example. A downward comparison is where I compare to people or groups of people who I perceive to be functioning lower level to myself. So maybe I perceive that they're a lower level academically or status, or that they've performed worse than I have on a particular task, for example. Now, researchers have suggested that social comparisons can result in positive and negative effects, but this is dependent on whether they're seen as contrasts or as assimilations. Now, contrasts are where you focus on the differences between you and the person or people you're comparing with, the social comparison target, that is. So, as opposed to a simulation, which is where you're comparing yourself and focusing on the similarities with yourself and the social comparison target. And I'll give you an example of how these upwards and downwards and contrast simulations have been deemed to impact learning and well-being. So, for example, I compare upwards with somebody that I perceive to be higher than myself, but I assimilate. I look at the similarities between me and that person, that social comparison target. Now I'm going to feel learning, aspiration, growth, because I can feel that I can be like that person or that's functioning above myself. However, if I focus on the contrasts between myself and that person, and I focus on the differences, I could feel jealous, I could feel inferior. If I compare downwards, so that's to a group or person that I perceive to be functioning lower than myself, and I assimilate and I look at the similarities between myself and that other person, then I'm going to experience anxiety and doubt, because I'm going to feel that I'm very similar to that person and that could well be me. If, however, I can't look at the differences between that person downwards, then I may feel superior and might be feeling relief. Well, thank goodness for that. That person's functioning at a lower level than me. However, I'm very different to that person, and at least that's not me. So that's a big relief. One of the things I'm very interested in finding out about is how social comparison is acted out in the classroom environment. There's been very little research conducted actually in the classroom environment, which actually involves children and their perceptions. And so I'm keen to find out how the abundance of social comparative information is utilised. For example, nowadays we ask children often to work in groups or work in pairs where they're having to collaborate together or help and support each other on a particular assignment or topic. In this way, children get to see very quickly each other's work. And not only that, nowadays we can see that children have the opportunity to look at each other's work on iPads, iPods, computers, as well as on whiteboards. And of course, through classroom discussions and through looking at other people's work, they're able to judge the standard of others, and against that judge the standard of themselves. And I'm very interested to find out how this information is perceived by children and how it is acted upon. Now, the research questions come out of some of the previous research that have been done and build on the previous research. Very little research seems to have been conducted really in the classroom environment with children. So one of the first things I wanted to do is really to be able to describe how the social comparative information that children see and hear in the classroom is experienced by children. So how does that happen? And to describe that. The next research question was to look at what impact this social comparative information has on children's thoughts, their feelings and their behaviour. So really looking at how they feel about social comparison, what that makes them do, how do they feel if their work is better than somebody else's or worse than somebody else's, and what does that make them do? Does that make them put more effort in? Does it make them feel frustrated and annoyed? Does that make them give up? Those sorts of understandings. And then to look at what impact does social comparison have on children's self-efficacy. So to really look at that understanding of children's self-perceptions and beliefs in their ability to retain and to perform well. Does comparing with someone else in their classroom and seeing somebody else's work, what effect does that have on them in terms of their own self-perceptions and self-beliefs? So having looked at some of the social comparison research and some of the research on self-efficacy, I'd like to now turn to the actual study that I'm going to present today. Now, the study was conducted with 182 pupils, and they were aged between 10 and 12 years. The mean age was 11.4 years, and there were 84 girls and 98 boys in the study. Now, the study was conducted in English classrooms, and their pupils attended two large junior government schools, which were educating mainstream children aged between 7 and 12 years. Now, the schools were deemed large because they had more than 300 students on the roll, which in fact is larger than the majority of schools in England, junior schools that is. So just to remind you, these schools were junior schools in which educated children from the age of 7 to 12 years. Now, there were all pupils were involved in the study had to give informed consent and parental consent for the interviews, and ethical guidelines were adhered to. Mixed method research was conducted so that there was quantitative and qualitative information and data gathered at the same time. All pupils completed a social comparison survey, as well as a Likert scaled self-efficacy questionnaire. Then children engaged with focus groups, and there were 70 pupils that were split into groups of 10 students for the focus groups. And then there were individual interviews with 16 of the pupils to gain a greater depth. So in this way, the mixed methods research, we have the ability to be able to explain what's going on in terms of the quantitative data, but also not just describe that, but also understand that and try to get some depth behind some of those figures with regarding the focus groups and the individual interviews. So I'm going to talk today about the qualitative results from the study. Although the study was mixed methods in which quantitative and qualitative data was collected, due to time constraints, I'm going to focus purely on the qualitative results. So that's the data and the results that were collected as the way of focus groups with 70 children and individual interviews with 16 of those children. Now, one of the interesting findings, results, was that all children admitted to comparing their schoolwork with their classroom. Some previous research has suggested that children or adults will not admit to comparing with others because it is socially undesirable. However, in this study, I was very cautious and made sure that all children had a full understanding of what I meant by social comparison prior to starting the study. So I was very keen to make them alert to the fact that it didn't include copying, because of course copying in the academic classroom is very much frowned upon and something that children would obviously not admit to. So I wanted them to know that it wasn't copying. This may have led to an increase in children admitting to compare their schoolwork, because now they knew that it wasn't socially undesirable. So all children did admit to comparing their schoolwork with their classmates. They didn't use the word comparison. Often they might use the word check. So they might say, yes, I like to check my work with somebody else's, and I like to see what somebody else is doing. Or they might say, I might look at somebody else's. So they say, yes, often I might say, can I have a look at yours and see how you've set yours out and what you've included. And they would use those sorts of words. All children were also able to identify the curriculum subject in which they were more likely to compare. So although children tended to compare very often, they all tended to be able to pick one or two subjects where they compared frequently. And the reasons they gave for that were because they were either less confident in that subject or they struggled in that subject. And so therefore they needed to have more information about how to do the the particular assignment or the particular piece of work that they were being set. And the way they did that was to be able to check that they were on the right lines and they were doing okay with their peers. So that was interesting. It was also interesting that all children said that they did use social comparison as a way to judge their schoolwork. So, although some children use social comparison more than others, all children did say that yes, they found it as a gauge as to be able to judge themselves based on what others were doing. Now, they used different social comparative information in the classroom to do that. So, whether it be explicit grades that they could hear the grades that other children were getting, they could see children being involved in classroom discussions, as well as being able to sit next to somebody or in a group and be a group work. They could actually see the content of somebody else's work. And children said that they used that as a way to judge their own work, and they would then go back to their own work and they would either alter it accordingly. Most people didn't, of the children, didn't see that as in any way a bad point. They viewed that as very much as the way that they were encouraged in the classroom to work together, and that only helped their work by improving it. A lot of children talked very much about the how somebody might set it out, the creativity that another child might use in looking at the task, and those sorts of things. And also, there are 6 strands when I analysed the results appeared from the data. And those strands were acknowledgement, so the acknowledgement of social comparisons, as I've mentioned above. The comparison target, so I did also talk to them very much about who they compared with or would prefer to compare with. Was it a friend? Was it somebody that was good at the subject? Was it somebody they were seated with? Was it always the same person? Was it a group of people? Those sorts of things. And I'm not going to discuss the results of that today. Comparison topics, as I've mentioned earlier, the topic was also one of the 6 strands involved. The direction of comparison, so whether they compared upwards and downwards, and most of the children tend to compare slightly above themselves in an upward direction. The effects of social comparison, and that's what I'm going to look at now in the next slide. I was very interested in the effects that seemed to be come out of my research, in where children had some very positive effects of social comparison, but also some negative effects. And so that's the strand of the research that I'm going to discuss now. So looking at the effects of social comparison, I was very interested in what the children themselves had to say. And a lot of the children had some very positive things to say about the impact of social comparison. For example, I feel pleased because I know I've reached a good standard. I feel more confident because that person has the same ideas. My friends help me and they make me try harder. So children's responses to the questions about social comparison in this group of children really emphasise the positive nature of social comparison. These children were harnessing social comparison and using it in a very positive light. They tended to be comparing upwards, but they would be assimilating to their peers. So they very much had the aspect of learning and growth and aspiration to achieve the same as their peers, and felt that very much they could do. So it was really very positive. However, there were other times where children in the study didn't have such positivity. There were negative aspects of social comparison that were evident. It makes me hate myself. I feel stupid, jealous, and frustrated. Now, these children that had these very negative effects of social comparison was still comparing upwards, but now they tended to compare upwards and focus on the contrasts, the differences between themselves and the people above them. And they would say to me that they felt that they would never be able to achieve the standard that they to which they were trying to achieve, compared to the person that or group of people that they were comparing with. These children tended, on the whole, to be the ones that were struggling or less confident in the work that they were doing, and had been identified as such by the teacher. And so therefore there seems to be two sets of groups of impact of social comparison that occur within the classroom environment. So I'll now turn to the findings of the study. As we can see, and we discussed in the previous slide when we looked at the children's voices, we can see that there are well-being issues related to social comparison in the classroom environment. There are positive effects of social comparison seen by children where they feel happy about comparing themselves with others. There's learning, growth, aspiration, and they put more effort into their work. However, there are also negative effects of social comparison where children feel frustrated, annoyed, disappointed, jealous, and full of anxiety. And it's part of this research really is to have to look at what can be done in the classroom environment to harness those positive aspects, but also combat the negative ones. It seems from this research that the well-being impacts of social comparison are mediated by the direction of social comparison, the social comparison target, the curriculum area in which social comparison occurs, and whether the child is utilising and focusing on simulations or contrasts. But further research is clearly needed in this area. One of the other findings was that some of the children were found to really completely disregard other more salient and objective forms of information, and instead relied too heavily upon social comparison information to judge their own performance. So what seemed to be occurring for many of the children was that it was the thoughts, feelings and perceptions that they had at the time of doing that piece of work, when that work was set in classroom, that stayed with them, and that was about how their work compared with others. If then the teacher came along and gave them some feedback, whether it be written or verbal feedback or potentially a grade, then that more objective information was ignored, because what stayed with the children was the fact that how theirs compared with their friends, and as long as they're compared okay to their friends, then some of the children completely ignored the teacher feedback. And in this way, there were misperceptions of capability, self-efficacy, were evident. So on the whole, there were strong correlations between self-efficacy and performance. But for some children, particularly those that were relying too heavily on social comparison, their self-efficacy perceptions were mismatched. So they would have very high level of self-efficacy, but actually low level performance, because they were tending to utilize social comparison to judge their work rather than any other form of information that was available in the classroom. Finally, gender differences in the social comparison and self-efficacy appear to be occurring. More data analysis is needed on this, and that will be an area for future research. So we turn to the implications of the research and further research. Well, there are implications for classroom interactions, because comparing oneself with others has been, from this study, been found to be an important aspect of the classroom environment. And students tend to be paying more attention to how their performance compares to that of their peers than how that compares to their past performance or the performance feedback given to them from the classroom teachers. So this seems to suggest that we need, as teachers, to pay more attention to peer dynamics in the classroom. When we think about it, children spend more time working with their peers than they do seeing the classroom teacher, and yet classroom teachers have been found often to plan for their own classroom interaction with children, but don't plan as much for their interaction between peers and peers. So I think that needs to be one of the take-home messages, that we need to have a look at that, and further research clearly needs to be done in this area. We also need to be looking at how teachers give feedback to their children, so that the negative effects of social comparison can be avoided, and the positive aspects of social comparison are enhanced and utilised within the classroom. Also, because of the positive and negative effects on well-being, and because of the misperceptions that seem to be continue, there possibly needs to be some explicit discussion with children within the classroom regarding social comparison. It seems from the research here that social comparison operates in the classroom as a bit like a black market, in where all the children are engaging in social comparison on a daily basis to check the standards that they're performing at, and yet it is seldom talked about or discussed by classroom teachers. And so further research is needed, so that we can know how to move forward on this. So to conclude my presentation, I'd like to suggest that further research is needed, which investigates how to harness the positive effects of social comparison in the classroom that we've seen, but really focus on the gender differences that occur, and the grouping strategies and different grouping strategies that teachers may be able to utilise in the classroom, to not just harness that powerful effect of social comparison, but also combat the negative effects of social comparison that we can see that are evident. So thank you everyone for taking the time to watch my presentation. Please contact me if you need any further information or details. You can see my email address at the bottom of the screen, and on the next page you'll see the references. Thank you.